Thank you very much. Is the sound system working okay? Strange, good. When we first thought about the format of this, Millie said that she thought this would be great because it would feel like a tutorial in public without having had to write an essay. And I hope that it will feel like that. In a way, I was thinking, actually, it was far from a situation in which Millie hadn't had to write an essay, because in fact, what Millie's done is to write a book, and that's one of the things we might talk about. But in the current tutorial system, we don't, in fact, read out our essays. What we do is ask people to summarise their arguments. So again, I think the conversation will be partly framed in that sort of way. I wanted to start off, picking up on what Ken just said. I think it would be very nice to frame this discussion in terms of thinking about journalism and journalism as a sort of vocation, as a sort of moral project, because I think that is very much, what you've felt, Millie. And I was very struck. I was reading about Don McCullin over the weekend. I don't know whether any of you saw the Observer interview with him, and he was talking about his project as a war photographer and as a photographer in general as a vocation rather than a career. And he also talked about how he felt his best work was the work he'd done in the 1970s, looking at, he said, my best story wasn't in a foreign war. My best story was the homeless story I did in the 1970s in Aldgate, on the periphery of the great money-making part of this country, the city. And he said he was more proud of these pictures and the social pictures of poverty in the north of England than of any of his war pictures. And I was thinking of you, and in a way, the work that you've done in Russia and Chechnya,
Right.
Thinking about, and actually the sort of sustained work that you've done over the last 10 years to address sort of marginalisation and poverty, disability, all the ways in which, I guess, people are marginalised in our society. And I just wondered whether you could start off by talking about, in a way, how the research into the Windrush came out of that sort of...
Yeah. So almost exactly 10 years ago, I came back to London and started working again with The Guardian after a break of several years working abroad in France and in Russia and in India. And when I came back, I thought it might be tremendously boring to be back in the UK, back on familiar territory, and writing about a country that was a lot more stable, certainly than both Russia and India. And so I went back to the newsroom in London feeling slightly apprehensive about what I was going to do. But actually, quite the reverse has been the case. It's been so interesting writing about Britain now, and I think I've been really, really lucky to work for The Guardian, that has still, despite the enormous financial problems that all newspapers are experiencing, it is still able to employ enough reporters to allow them to go off and spend time looking at issues which aren't necessarily issues that have to be written about for the paper tomorrow, or aren't necessarily things that urgently have to be on the front page, but are just kind of much slower thematic processes. And it really is an amazing place to be employed. And I think that is, when I look at some of my colleagues who work at other media organisations where the pressure is much, much more on them to produce things for the next day's paper, I think I've been really lucky to have editors who just allow me to get on with it quite slowly.
But I suppose that was also, obviously that's been your serious project to keep up that momentum as well, and to actually, in a way, identify areas of social challenge, I suppose, which have led you on a connected journey from fourth generation unemployment in Middlesbrough, as it were, to people on having their disability benefits cut, and then I wonder whether you could say something about how the Windrush research, in a sense, gathered momentum, and I suppose what it was that enabled that to get traction.
So in a way, the reporting that I began to do about immigration in 2017 was a continuation of the kinds of things that I've been doing for the last decade, where I've been isolating bits of government policy and trying to go away from Westminster and trying to look at how those bits of policy have really impacted on the people that they've been designed for. So usually looking at areas where there have been problems, particularly around implementation of reforms to disability benefits, reforms to the whole benefit system. And the starting point often for me has been that in the abstract, these things seem incredibly complicated and possibly quite boring to a lot of people who haven't had immediate contact with them. So the most powerful way, I think, of making people understand that there is a problem is by doing detailed interviews with those people affected. And it sounds kind of obvious, but it's actually remarkable how much reporting about government policy is done from Westminster without really the experiences and voices of those people who are at the other end of the line. And so that's really what I've been doing for years. And at the end of 2017, I had an email from a small charity in Wolverhampton who asked me to go and look at the case of one of the people that they'd been trying to help, who was a woman called Paulette Wilson, who's this woman here, who is a grandmother who lived in Britain for over 50 years. She was 61 in 2017, and somebody who'd spent all of her adult life, she arrived at the age of 10, in the UK, who'd worked at the House of Commons for a while as a catering assistant. And the email said that she had been sent to Yarl's Wood, which is one of the most notorious detention centres, immigration removal centres, and that she was being imminently scheduled for deportation back to Jamaica, a country that she hadn't visited for over half a century. So it wasn't immediately obvious that this was anything other than a very peculiar anomaly. But we published a story about her in November 2017, and very slowly it began to become obvious from emails and phone calls that I had at The Guardian that she wasn't the only person who'd received that kind of treatment.
Yeah. So how did the process of as Ken says, forensic attention to individuals, how did it build up?
So the day after we published a case about the story about Paulette, I had had a phone call from somebody who said that his father had been in detention for 5 weeks, and he was also somebody who'd lived in Britain for over half a century, who'd arrived as a 9-year-old. And he was also being threatened with deportation to Jamaica. So I went to see him, and I spent a morning with him trying to understand why it was that the Home Office was still slating him for deportation. And as I spoke to him, I was very surprised because he didn't seem himself to be particularly, it didn't seem to him as outrageous as it did to me that he was being treated in that way. And he said that was because he knew about half a dozen other people who had also arrived in Britain as children and who hadn't been sent to detention, but were having similarly unpleasant experiences with losing their jobs or being denied access to housing. So at the end of that second interview, it was quite clear to me that there was some kind of much bigger systemic problem. Yeah. But what was really amazing was that none of the MPs who I contacted about it, or the law centres, or the charities who normally are really on top of these kinds of issues, none of them were really able to explain what was happening or how widespread it was. So for me, that became quite a kind of it was quite frustrating for a couple of months because it was so hard to get answers, and there was this real disconnect between the numbers of individuals who were getting in touch with really quite serious accounts of problems that they were having, people who'd lost their homes, lost their jobs, been denied access to NHS care. On the one hand, very, very serious accounts of real problems, and on the other hand, a real lack of information from the people who ought to know about it, and a complete refusal by the government or by the Home Office to respond in any way or to acknowledge that there was any problem.
And in a way, do you think that in a sense, when it did gather momentum, and in a sense you systematically, in a sense, managed to put those bits together, and it obviously came to a head. I mean, in a sense, it seems to me there's a sort of paradox that when the government apologised, if you like, and when Amber Rudd was forced into saying something, in a way there was a distinction made, wasn't there? That she said something about we've lost sight of the individual in thinking about the general, if you like.
Yeah.
But in a sense that in itself was a problematic move because it isolated the particular individual as if it was a series of individual mistakes instead of actually really acknowledging the nature of how it had come about in the first place.
Yeah, I mean there were so many problems with the government's response as the months went on, but also once it became impossible to ignore. I mean, firstly, it was the sheer kind of brazen speed with which officials went from saying this isn't a problem, we're not worried about it, to almost within 24 hours to suddenly saying, actually, this is something that we're very worried about, these stories are heartbreaking, we think this is terrible.
Yeah.
And it was an extraordinary 180-degree turnabout, and kind of even for somebody who feels quite world weary, it was quite a kind of shocking shift in position. And there are a number of reasons why they suddenly felt that they had to respond and apologise. One of them, the most significant being that the heads of government from all of the Commonwealth countries had arrived in London for this biannual Commonwealth summit, which normally is an occasion that goes entirely unreported on by the press and is just a kind of happy occasion for cocktail parties. Yeah. But this year it was invested with last year invested with real importance, because in a post-Brexit climate, suddenly there was a real desire to court all of our Commonwealth partners and to find alternative
different alliances.
Yeah. So the weight of importance on that meeting put on it by the government was ratcheted up, and then it was just this very, very unfortunate situation that it turned out that the High Commissioners had finally themselves realised that there was a problem that they needed to do something about, and had requested a meeting with 10 Downing Street during the summit. And for whatever stupid or incompetent reason, Downing Street had responded that Theresa May didn't have time to have a meeting with them. And I'd been writing about this by that point for 6 months, and occasionally getting articles on the front page, but not regularly. But Guardian readers were very aware that this was a kind of a terrible problem. And yet it was only when we put that piece on the front page that suddenly the government felt that it had to respond. And then in the space of a week, there were 3 separate apologies from Theresa May in a kind of increasing with, the original apology was rather a kind of I'm sorry that you're cross kind of apology.
Yes,
or, she kept saying we're very sorry for the anxiety caused, as if being detained in a detention centre for 5 weeks is a source of anxiety.
Minor anxiety,
yeah. So there was a kind of an increasing realization from her that she needed to respond and apologise more fulsomely. And then for 2 weeks, Amber Rudd was being called back to the House of Commons again and again. And I think she was due to have to make her 5th statement to the House of Commons in the space of a fortnight when she decided that actually she needed to resign. But you're right that her original assessment of what had gone wrong was that that Home Office officials had been too caught up in the policy that they were trying to implement and had lost sight of the individual. And that went down incredibly badly with employees at the Home Office, because it felt as if she was blaming them for their implementation of what was actually a very deliberate bit of government policy, which was Theresa May's hostile environment policy, which had been introduced in 2012 and was growing in strength. So she really was hit quite hard by having tried to push the blame onto them. Not least because Home Office officials started leaking documents about how enthusiastic she had been about a lot of the measures that they were obliged then to implement.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, do you think that focus on, in a way, or the exposure, if you like, of the relationship between the individual and the wider culture, if you like, in a sense, has on the one hand, it created a climate of, a lot of support for the Windrush, generation, if you like, at the time, and there was a lot of, outrage, a sense of, this obviously being a natural injustice, if you like, and there was a lot of warmth expressed, in terms of public opinion. But in some ways, that in itself started to create a distinction between where different types of, long settled, immigrants in this country, and it seemed to me that contained within it the seed of, in a sense, what one's seen later. I mean, that actually it was a very brief moment, wasn't it, when it seemed positive and...
Yeah, it's been immensely problematic for lots of reasons. I mean, firstly, it suited the government to say, yes, we acknowledge that there was this problem in our handling of the Windrush scandal, which really narrows the problem down to a very, very small group of people, people born in the Caribbean who attracted this kind of slightly inaccurate term of Windrush generation, when actually the problem that they're talking about, the failure of the Home Office to give documents to thousands of people who arrived here before 1973, potentially affects tens of thousands of people, not just from the Caribbean countries, but from across the Commonwealth. So that, I mean, it was convenient for the government to say this is this problem. But much more widely, there is this very, very difficult question that I think we face as journalists, but also that campaigners in the migration sector face, which is how do you bring members of the public on side to support what you're campaigning about, and the creation of groups of migrants. So you have kind of good migrants like the Windrush people were, and they we characterize them as people who've been here for a very long time, who were taxpayers, who were law-abiding, who hadn't committed any crimes, and who were being wrongly targeted. All of which was true, and all of which was absolutely helpful in creating a sense of national outrage. But it does become a lot more complicated when you see this week, for example, the government beginning deportation flights back to the Caribbean, and I think hoping that somehow public opinion would not be behind the people who they were deporting, because these are people who they can cast as undeserving, bad migrants. And Sajid Javid was in the House of Commons this week saying on that flight, there are murderers, there are rapists, they're all serious criminals. But it didn't take much asking to find out that actually there was one murderer, and one of the people who's been deported on Wednesday was a 23-year-old who'd had a dangerous driving conviction. So that question about how, as journalists, how we present people, and perhaps, it's easier sometimes to say, well, we shouldn't deport this person because he's fought in Afghanistan and he's a good person.
He's a national hero.
But the real question that we should be focusing on is, what do we want our immigration system to look like? And do we think it's right to deport people who've lived in this country all their lives, regardless of what offence they've committed?
Yeah, and there's both a legal question, isn't there? Because in a sense, if they had the right papers and they were British citizens and they'd served their time in jail, then in a sense the distinction between being a criminal of whatever sort and not being a criminal wouldn't apply, would it? So there's that problem, but there's also, as you say, the broader issue of this tendency to create categories amongst within a pluralistic society, if you like, and to try to distinguish a hierarchy of moral virtue, if you like, and it's a really difficult problem within, I suppose, ideas of liberalism, isn't it? We think of Britain still thinks of itself as a liberal society and an open society and a pluralistic society. But of course, since the late 19th century, really, or if not earlier, but since the late 19th century, early 20th century, when the first formal immigration, restrictions were introduced, that, again, there was the rhetoric on the one hand of, we've always been a very welcoming society, we've always benefited from immigrants, we've actually been enriched by pluralism on the one hand, but then the but is, but we don't want people coming in who are going to undermine that. So the liberalism is always on certain terms, isn't it? And in a way, the Theresa May rhetoric of, the awful rhetoric of, citizens of nowhere, as if that somehow is her idea that there's a particularly narrow form of citizenship and that you can't have multiple ideas of belonging, is, completely, challenging to the enriched pluralism of a liberal, genuinely liberal society.
So over the last couple of months, I've been talking to politicians, both Conservative and Labour, about how they feel that we got to a place where things began to go so wrong, or things began to go so wrong so publicly, because I think they were going wrong quietly for a long time. And both Diane Abbott and Oliver Letwin on the left and the right said that the problem was really that for decades, both the left and the right have failed to make the case publicly that immigration is good for the country. They've kind of collectively, the political classes have thought that public opinion felt that immigration was bad, and so that their responsibility was to say, well, in that case, then what we must do is we must control it, which led to Labour creating the mugs that said, we will control immigration, that they put on sale before the 2015 election, and which led to David Cameron's target to get migration down to the tens of thousands, which then led to all of the hostile environment policies. And yet, another path to go down would have been to somehow say publicly and bravely, immigration contributes X amount to the economy, and this is something we should celebrate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really, no one is doing that apart from a few Liberal Democrats.
Yeah. So where do you think? In a sense, your point about the Theresa May's reference to causing a bit of anxiety, if you like. Clearly, the whole issue of the quote Windrush generation, I mean, in a sense, has had a much wider impact on other groups who feel very anxious about their own status, don't they? I mean, in a sense, in the Brexit context, obviously, what's going to happen to Europeans who've settled in this country. I mean, in a sense, it's from the point of view of the people who are feeling anxious, in inverted commas. The anxiety has only escalated, hasn't it? Over.
Yeah, I mean, I feel again very conflicted, because I think a lot of really, really positive things have happened since Amber Rudd resigned and since Theresa May apologised. We've seen about 4,000 people getting citizenship from the Windrush Commonwealth generation. So people who didn't have papers before have now been granted papers. And
quite a tiny figure, isn't it?
It's a tiny figure, but if you think 4,000 people times their family, then a number of hostile environment policies have been paused, although there hasn't been any repeal of the fundamental legislation. And even if they haven't done an enormous amount about it, it's kind of superficially quite encouraging to hear Sajid Javid saying that he wants to see a more humane and fair Home Office. So we can kind of grasp at that as a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
And there have been other kind of really tangible things. So there's been a reduction in the number of people who've been deported, a 40% reduction in the number of people who've been sent to immigration detention centres. So those positive things are happening. And then the question of whether or not there's been any real shift in the kind of public debate around immigration. And I was talking to campaigners this week about this deportation flight, who were saying a year ago there just wouldn't have been any outcry about it at all. And the fact that people are beginning to question the Home Office when it says these are all criminals, and think perhaps it's right to ask whether or not we take that at face value, represents something of a shift in the right direction. Yeah. But it is, as you say, there was a moment of great optimism last summer that something might change fundamentally or permanently, and I don't really feel 6 months on that we've entirely seen that.
Yeah. And what do you think about the relationship between? I mean, obviously, in a sense, Brexit and the Brexit debates have, driven some of these things off the front pages, but yet, obviously, there's the whole issue of, an awful lot of other people feeling very alienated.
So one of the things I'm hoping to look at in the next few weeks is the process for registration of these 3.8 million European citizens who are living here, whose status has somehow to be made formal. And the government is saying that it's learned some of the lessons of Windrush, and it's going to make it easier for those people. It's not going to be looking for reasons to deny people status. It's going to be looking for reasons to give them the status. But given what we know about the fundamental incompetence of the Home Office, and given the numbers involved, even if just 10% of those 3.8 million people have problems, that's 380,000 people who then get shifted across this kind of invisible line between legality to illegality, which, given all of the tightened restrictions following the hostile environment, really makes life extremely impossible or extremely difficult.
Yeah. And then meanwhile, I suppose there are a whole lot of other people who are, for example, people from Bangladesh who are suffering under the whole ongoing legal cases about, false qualifications from language schools and what have you. I mean, that sort of runs along, again, with nobody really picking it up, because in a sense it's less of a media priority than either Brexit or...
Yeah. I mean, I think what the thing that's been most kind of amazing to understand writing about this is that viewed at kind of from far away, you think that there are these two different groups of people who are here legally and people who are here illegally, and that the Home Office would know exactly who is who. They don't know. No. And secondly, it's also very, very that there is no kind of firm line between them. It's often you can be pushed into this kind of status of illegality simply because you haven't had the right fees to pay for the Home Office application forms, which are increasingly expensive. Yeah. Or it might be because you've had an application rejected and you're in the process of trying to appeal against it, or it might be because a form's gone missing. You can kind of find yourself pushed into this area of illegality really very easily, and it's extraordinarily hard to get redress.
Even if you're not in it, you're anxious about the possibility of being in it in a way.
And the really kind of sad thing about the timing of all of these policies was the coincidence of the removal of legal aid for most immigration cases, which I think happened in about 2012. And also, to a certain extent, the kind of collapse of local newspapers and media. So people weren't getting any legal aid, and still aren't. And the places that you could turn to say this really terrible thing has happened to me were shrinking. And much as we're all trying to be enthusiastic about kind of new media alternatives, these weren't issues that were being highlighted on Twitter, or just were very, very hidden.
Yeah, well, that's where, I mean, coming back to the brilliance of your work, I mean, where, your process of, uncovering these stories and actually, putting them all together. And obviously you've now written a book which is coming out in the autumn. And we talked about the whole project of writing a book, and I suppose the relationship between, the daily journalism and the effect that can have, and what writing a book might do. So it'd be really interesting to hear you talk about that, but also to think about, I mean, you're absolutely right, individual cases which actually, touch people and catch the attention, are clearly, crucial to enabling people to understand this and to think, sympathetically and to engage imaginatively. What sort of toll does that take on you, in a sense? Because a lot of the time obviously you have a sense that it's crucial to do that because cumulatively it will have an impact and you can change things. But in a lot of cases, I guess it's also, that these individuals are not necessarily, going to have their lives transformed immediately. Does that?
Yeah. Well, this was a really unusual bit of reporting, because it's always very, very hard to ask somebody to be interviewed and talk about, their lives, and particularly to talk about things going wrong in their lives, and then to have a picture taken and to have all of those bad things about their lives in the paper and also online forever. So the kind of transience of newspapers that there used to be, you could just say, well, it's fish and chip paper. You can't really do that now because it will be there forever. So it is an enormous step to encourage somebody to take. And a lot of the time, I might say, well, it's be a constructive thing to do because it will help educate people about something that's going wrong. But you couldn't really say that there was going to be a kind of personal
solution, is it right?
Yeah. However, in this case, that was one of the only sort of fun things about doing this reporting was the speed with which the Home Office would suddenly mysteriously help out in these cases. And so often, as we were thinking about what the headline might be on an article, I'd have a call on my phone saying, I've just had a package couriered from the Home Office and my papers have come. And so it was kind of a bit disgusting in a way, but also it made it a lot easier because I could say, it would be useful for the general kind of good to be interviewed and to have your picture taken.
And you might
might also be helpful.
Yeah.
But it did take, to begin with, it was very, very difficult to persuade people because the atmosphere is so toxic around illegal immigration. Nobody wanted to have their picture taken and be underneath the headline that said illegal immigrant. I mean, you wouldn't.
Yeah. Yes, and in a sense, that's the essence of the problem, isn't it? That, I mean, trust in any sort of fair treatment, I mean, was so much eroded that...
Which I think is, again, why it remained so hidden for such a long time, is because people just didn't want to talk about it. They felt that, in some sense, it was their own fault, and they felt that they would be judged for having become illegal immigrants.
Yeah.
And you can really understand that, you know... So all of these people were very brave to come forward. I feel particularly sad about this woman, Sarah O'Connor, who died in September before. Anyway, she was extremely stressed about her situation, and
Well, it's a tribute to you that they did trust you enough to, to expose their vulnerability, and that's.
The other thing that, and looking at this, the Guardian did a really good thing at the beginning of this kind of reporting process, and it made a commitment to take really good portraits of everybody involved. And I think when you look at their faces, and it just, I'm sure that had an impact. I mean, they just are people who, well, it's kind of hard to express exactly why, but they,
Well, and that taking of good portraits is a it's a validation that gives status, doesn't it, and to each individual voice. So could you just finish up this part of the session just by talking about the book a little bit and the relationship between the book and the daily journalism?
It's really hard to know because I haven't written a book before, and certainly there is this enormous time lag. So I'm, having written 110,000 words, remain very kind of obsessively interested in the issue. And I just think we'll have to see where we are in the autumn. I mean, I think all of these issues around how the government relates to people who are kind of on the margins will remain.
It's not going to go out of date, is it? Yeah. Wonderful. Well, let's throw this open to the floor. I'm sure lots of people have questions. There's a hand going up at the back. Not waving. Yeah. Yep. No, do. Is there a roving mic? Yeah. Over there, Rachel.
Thank you. I wonder if you could say something about to what extent did this scandal arise because of the person who was Home Secretary, who you could argue is developing a pattern of taking hardline positions and delivering them incompetently. I make no further comment on a certain other matter. And to what extent, from all your work, you found that irrespective of who the Home Secretary was, it's all to do with the fact that the Home Office is basically the most incompetent part of Whitehall, although the threshold for that's quite low.
Yeah. I think to be kind of totally even-handed, and this is a point that that Theresa May likes to make a lot. This scandal had roots that go much, much beyond Theresa May's arrival at the Home Office. So we were seeing people being wrongly deported to Jamaica and also being stuck in Jamaica in the late 1990s and under Blair and Brown in the 2010s. But it's certainly the case that Theresa May made it a goal or a mission from quite early on in her time in the Home Office to make, she said she was going to make she wanted to create a very hostile environment in Britain for illegal immigrants. And she went systematically through all of the departments that she could cooperate with to draw bits of policy from Department of Health, from Department of Work and Pensions, Education Department, to create this hostile environment, with the support of David Cameron, who was as enthusiastic about it as she was. But in parallel, there were cuts to all government departments, and the Home Office saw a 20% cut, I think, or possibly more, to its headcount. And so you had this really bad coming together of very, very stringent new policies and a removal of experienced staff, which certainly didn't help.
Hi, very different question. I was intrigued to hear at the beginning when the fact that you'd had these experiences in Russia and India, and I wonder to what extent the process of picking out what was going on, that the fact that you'd had those experiences in some ways enabled you to view the way in which the British state was working in a way which you wouldn't have done if you'd never left it.
I totally think so, because I think there's when you're working abroad as a foreign correspondent, you are looking obviously at the country that you're living in as somebody from the outside, and you're finding everything very strange, and it's quite hard to understand a lot of things, and so your picture, your kind of range of what you're interested in is much wider, and so I think you're much less caught up with the day-to-day minutiae of what one minister said to another. So definitely when I came back, particularly having spent quite a lot of time away, I did feel a bit like a kind of foreigner viewing my own country, and that was a really constructive and helpful thing. It's unfortunately worn off a little bit now, mm-hmm. But the other thing about being a foreign correspondent is you're constantly having to translate what you're seeing for readers elsewhere, and actually, I mean that's quite a helpful thing to be doing anyway, because usually, a large proportion of your readers aren't very well versed in Home Office policy. So yeah.
Translation is a process. Is about creative defamiliarization of your own language, yes. Isn't it? So,
yes.
Amelia, I appreciate that you're not a lawyer, but I feel it in my bones that over the last 60 years the law has got it wrong somewhere. Are you able to comment on that?
I'm not sure if I am. I feel more that I'm really sad that the support of lawyers has been removed from so many of the people who really could have benefited from it. So I'm not sure that I'm pointing finger of blame at the lawyers, much more at the politicians. And I'm just sorry that the law centres and legal aid charities aren't able to be as helpful as I think that they were 5-10 years ago. I'm not sure, maybe Ken, you were able to answer that better.
No, I think that's right. Mm-hmm. I think actually the courts have been quite a strong line of defence against some of the worst government policies. So judicial review, there have been lots of successful judicial reviews in this area. And the courts have intervened quite regularly to stop deportations or to delay them. I think the problem is that Parliament has passed bad legislation, and many lawyers have sought to mitigate its worst effects.
Yeah, and certainly again, looking at this deportation flight that left on Wednesday, I think that there was a law change in 2007 that said that anyone who's committed an offence for which they've had a sentence of more than 12 months is automatically deported. And what we've seen is in the last few days is a lot of people doing last-minute appeals against that. And also what we've seen in a kind of depressing way is how, again, media exposure trumps everything. And there were meant to be 50 people going on this flight, and in the end only 29 did. And the ones who were taken off were generally the ones who whose stories had been written about, which feels a really terrible way of implementing policy.
Yeah.
I am a lawyer, so thank you for the defence of lawyers. But in my work life, I find that for every case that gets to court, we have 10 or 15 that settle before, partly because of the risk they might lose, but also because of the risk of the publicity. And I wondered if there's a journalistic equivalent of that. Are there, 17 other Windrushes that have been headed off at the pass because you interviewed the right person, or is the only response that politicians give the Home Office papers in a box appearing just in the nick of time so they get a good line at the end of the story? Do they ever manage to head the story off at the pass or make a change that means the story dies before you do anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've often come across cases that I felt reflect policy going wrong, of somebody, I don't know, getting the wrong, being denied housing, and then suddenly just a couple of days before, because we have a responsibility as a journalist, we always have to go to the department and say, we're writing this story, can you comment on it? Which gives us a kind of 24 hours to allow them to think about how they want to respond. But often within that 24 hours, somebody might suddenly get a letter saying your housing situation has been resolved. And that does often, deflate an enthusiasm for giving a good slot to an article. I think more than that, I think that the kind of scandals are just hidden because they're hidden, and there aren't as many well-funded media organisations around doing kind of footwork as there might have been 10, 20 years ago. And that's why I do find it really amazing that, a lot of it is very easy to get hold of people on Twitter now or through other bits of social media, and that kind of contact is much swifter, but it hasn't kind of led to a forum where really marginalised people having real problems are able to attract attention to people who can help them. And I'm not quite sure why that is.
And again, it all becomes very individualised, doesn't it? Obviously, because the ones who can generate that support,
yeah,
are the ones who benefit. So
yeah.
I think a good example of these poor people who are so voiceless and marginalised, and you were dead right to say the word scandal there. Funnily enough, the Catholic Church, with the Cardinal intervening and talking about the scandal of refugees and the Jesuit refugee service, and really your wonderful work in exposing this Windrush scandal, this is all part of a continuum. It is the hostile environment, and when you ask universities and hospitals to start denouncing people for being illegal aliens, etc., we're in a very, very worrying time. And these are all scandals. So I think the question there about bad law, this is deeply, deeply unethical. And that's what needs to be looked at.
Yeah.
And it really is a terrible blight.
So the thing I think that I feel most sad about is when Amber Rudd began to realise that this was a mistake that couldn't continue to be ignored, she promised that there would be a reform within the Home Office, and then Sajid Javid has promised that there will be this new kinder, more sympathetic department. But this whole system of outsourcing border guard control to individuals and to untrained amateurs, to civilians, so making doctors, teachers, civil servants, council workers, landlords, making them all have to perform the task of checking whether somebody is here legally or illegally, that all remains in place. And I think that the point that lots of people have made, that it's just very hard to have legislation that requires you to check whether somebody is an illegal immigrant or not. It's hard to do that without becoming suspicious of people who you think look like illegal immigrants. And for people who aren't trained, who don't know how to check documents, or it's it's inevitably going to lead to discrimination.
The people you were dealing with in this cohort were people of colour from Caribbean countries mostly, who were Commonwealth citizens. I just wonder if you were able to explore with them their own sense of identity, how they describe themselves, Jamaican, English, British, Black British.
Yeah.
And if they describe themselves as British, do you have a sense of how the general British public might view that self-identification?
So yeah, that was a question that I asked everyone, and I remember asking Paulette, who was the first woman I met, and she was really affronted by the question, and I felt that I'd been rude, because she said, of course I'm British. What else could I possibly be? Because she'd arrived at the age of 10, she hadn't been back to Jamaica, and she hadn't ever had enough money to go on holiday, ever needed a passport, which was actually a common theme for most of the people that I spoke to. None of them had got passports because they'd arrived, or their parents had arrived, weren't ever employed in very well-paid jobs. And so, the sense of being British wasn't to do with having a document, it was just an understanding. The kind of broader response of readers, I suppose, or of everyone else in Britain, was, I think, to say, but of course these people absolutely are British, and that's what Theresa May said in one of her many apologies, that these people are British and they always have been. And that was, she probably went slightly beyond what the legal position was, but that she understood that most people, of course, these are people who've been in primary school here, who we've all been to school with. It's kind of an absurdity to suggest that they are illegal.
The Daily Mail readers would.
Well, the really amazing thing is actually that, much as I want to say that this scandal was entirely solely triggered by The Guardian, having had almost no other media report on the issue, a couple of days before the Commonwealth Summit, the Daily Mail reprinted without attribution. And we did get some money from them afterwards, but they reprinted a lot of these stories, and they said that they were going to launch a campaign on this issue, and they interviewed one of the people. And I think having the Daily Mail threatening a campaign probably is also something that made the government more worried than having The Guardian endlessly.
You call this talk the Windrush scandal, the risk of exposing money. May I understand? I think that by the Windrush scandal we mean those who came on that particular ship,
and
whose records were not properly kept or distributed to those who came. Can you help me? First, how does the 4,000 number that you gave corrected compare with the number who actually came on that boat?
Yeah.
And are you not now describing something different from the Windrush scandal itself, but some other difficulties? I'm sorry, I don't want to understate the case. The difficulties that have arisen in regard to totally different groups of immigrants, particularly from the Caribbean, but much, much more widely.
So that there was the idea of calling this group of people Windrush people came from a campaigner who noticed that as we were writing more and more about the problems that this group of people were experiencing, we were approaching the 70th anniversary of the arrival of Empire Windrush in 1948. And on that ship, which has become the kind of symbol of the first wave of immigration to the large-scale immigration to the UK. Large-scale Caribbean immigration to the UK. There were 460, I think, people from Jamaica and other Caribbean countries. None of these people are those people. On the whole, they're the next generation down. But it became something that politicians kind of seized on as a useful shorthand for this problem. And it was really useful because before then, I'd really struggled to get to be able to explain what the problem was in a way that could be summed up in a headline, because I was having to explain that these were older Caribbean born people who were approaching retirement age, who'd lived in this country for 50 years and who were experiencing immigration problems. And you just couldn't put that in a headline. So it was useful to call them the Windrush generation, even though, as you say, accurately, they're not. It really refers to anybody who's arrived in this country from anywhere in the Commonwealth before the beginning of 1973, which is when immigration laws got tightened. And the issue around lost documents is a slightly wider issue, which goes to a decision in 2010 to destroy a number, but not all, of the registration slips that were being kept in the Home Office. And they claim that they destroyed them because it was in breach of GDPR data or something like that. But I think it was actually because they needed to move buildings and there wasn't enough room to store them or not enough room to digitize them.
Amelia, I know you're quite busy until the autumn. This may be something the Guardian might be something. It arises out of the question which my friend asked about people's identity and nationality. I don't know if you're aware that everybody who now appears in court has to state, obligatory, with a penalty if they don't, what their nationality is.
I didn't know that.
It's never been explained why, and it's very clear that when you ask people their nationality, you don't get their nationality, and people such as the Windrush would always say they were British, regardless that they don't hold a British passport or may not have done. I'd be interested to know, or if you could maybe put it on the radar, because I think it affects all this sort of hostile environment, immigration policy that's going on, why people are asked their nationality, and as a result of the data which courts now have to keep in relation to people's nationality, what is done with it? Because it really is another scandal that we're asking people in this day and age their nationality without knowing what happens to it and what the consequences of that are.
Yeah, I don't know why, but I know that people, when they go to hospital, are being asked to fill in forms where they, again, have to reveal nationality. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if it's part of that same trend for gathering more and more data in this area. But the thing that I hadn't realised until I started looking at this is how many people, British and not British, don't have passports. So I think it's something like 17% of the population doesn't have a passport. So something like 9 million people don't have passports. So this idea that, you know, having a British passport is what makes you British, it sort of isn't.
Well, also in a world that's very diasporic, I mean, the whole notion that, you know, in a sense, citizenship is a very narrow thing, is completely, contrary to people's sense of their own identity or belonging. I mean, that's, so again, the Theresa May statement, in 2016 that people who thought of themselves as citizens of the world, were actually citizens of nowhere, because they didn't have a proper sense of citizenship. And that was a complete affront to, again, most people's sense of themselves, and that's not been forgotten by, I think, a lot of people who, are part of a broader diasporic world, which again we ought to be celebrating, but Yes, everybody's tapping at their watches. We need to get to have a drink. But it's such a wonderful discussion, and thank you so much, Millie. It takes me back to tutorials of the, and we must do it more often.
Really nice. Thank you.